spirituality and Indian music. He began studying sitar with Ravi Shankar.
He came to me in such a down-to-earth manner and asked me questions about music, and I was really very, very touched by his approach. It was, I would say, love at first sight.
George Harrison's new taste in Eastern music put the Beatles back in the musical vanguard. He was leading the Beatles, and it was a new experience.
For the first time, here was a little trend within the Beatles that George was setting. It wasn't simply that he was, a kid tagging along with the ideas and interests of the big boys. He was leading them.
It was kind of mind-blowing at the time he did it, I mean, we're just a few years after Buddy Holly, and here's a guy bringing Ravi Shankar, his sound, into the biggest band that ever was.
Now, Lennon and McCartney, the leaders of the biggest band that ever was, were for the first time giving Harrison more say.
It was the strongest creative period for George Harrison because he had just discovered Indian religion, and the Beatles wanted the sound of Indian music on their records. They wanted that sound. The Rolling Stones were doing it, they wanted to do it, and they wanted to do it better. So that gave George power in the studio.
And in February 1968, George and his wife Patty once again led the rest of the Beatles, this time on a pilgrimage to Rishikesh, India. There they studied transcendental meditation under the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. They were joined by other celebrities, Mia Farrow, Donovan, Mike Love of the Beach Boys, all looking for inner peace.
It's just mystical beyond belief, and it's beautiful too, because you have the huge river coming and flowing onto the plains. We were above the banks of the Ganges, a few hundred feet up, looking out, and it was just an idyllic, mystical, spiritual, beautiful place.
And it was a place of creative freedom for all the Beatles. Rishikesh inspired the songs of the White Album.
One typical day, Paul McCartney came down to the breakfast table with his acoustic guitar, playing a song that he had just written. He said, "Listen to this, Mike," and flew in from Miami Beach, BOAC. He was writing back in the USSR, and I said, "Hey, Paul, you ought to talk about all the girls around Russia in the bridge," and which he did.
McCartney and Lennon weren't the only ones writing great music. In this spiritual place, George Harrison composed songs that were anything but spiritual.
George started to write songs which were witty and rather naughty in a sort of Lennon way, emotional in a McCartney way. So While My Guitar Softly Weeps has this kind of McCartney sort of heart on your sleeve kind of passion.
But as George Harrison focused on himself, his marriage to Patty began showing the strain. The relationships between the Beatles began to founder too. Harrison and McCartney bickered with each other during a recording session for the film Let It Be.
All of George's resentment spilled out, and he said, "You've never given me time on Beatles albums, you've never given me enough time." He accused Paul McCartney of always trying to teach him how to play the guitar.
During that same film, the Beatles gave an impromptu concert on the rooftop of Apple headquarters. What the crowds didn't know was the band was reaching its breaking point. It would be the last Beatles concert ever. But the band patched things together long enough to record Abbey Road in 1969, their last and some say greatest album.
When they did the Abbey Road album, George came into his own then and shone like mad on that album. Some of the best guitar playing he ever did is on that album.
The last few Beatles records, he was just hitting them out of the park. I mean, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun, Something. I mean, every one of them a modern standard.
Something in the way she moves attracts me like no other lover.
Harrison was finding his voice and already branching out on his own. He'd released a solo production, the soundtrack Wonderwall, in 1968. And John Lennon had all but left the band for his new love, Yoko Ono. Then, in April 1970, a frustrated Paul McCartney announced he was quitting. It was really over. A bitter end to a brilliant 7-year run for the world's greatest rock band. And George Harrison was on his own, at last.
The breakup of the Beatles liberated George Harrison. It freed him to build his own house and to be master within it.
Right after the Beatles broke up, George Harrison released his first album, All Things Must Pass, in 1970. It was critically acclaimed and revealed him to be a strong solo artist. George Harrison finally on his own.
With All Things Must Pass, the floodgates opened, you know, and all these songs that hadn't found their way into the Beatles' oeuvre suddenly had a place to go, and what a place. I mean, that record is so deep.
His spirituality shone through in his writing. Songs like My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, and The Art of Dying. He was exploring new topics, and he was asking big questions.
I mean, the guy wrote a song called What Is Life? You know, I mean, that's a big topic to take on in a pop song. I think he had bigger things on his mind than a hit record. I think he wanted to, you know, change the world.
And in 1971, he tried, when his mentor, Ravi Shankar, agonized about the crisis in his native Bangladesh. Harrison organized the Concert for Bangladesh. It was the first major rock benefit in history.
He saw my anguish and, you know, my sorrow, but when he heard about my plan and the feeling that I was going through, he said, Ravi, I'll help you. And that's how it started.
He called me and said that his friend Ravi Shankar had called him. They were having this terrible famine over in Bangladesh, and he had this idea of doing this benefit concert and asking his friends to play in it.
Nothing like it had ever been done before. Tens of thousands of people crammed into Madison Square Garden to see some of the biggest rock stars of the time. George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Leon Russell.
It was one of the most exciting things that I have, you know, witnessed. He wrote a song, Bangladesh, Bangladesh, and overnight the name of Bangladesh was everywhere.
People had high hopes back in those days. And there's the old fable of the Pied Piper. Music definitely has a power built in.
She really was the first guy to step forward and say, maybe we can use this rock culture that we've created for some good. And I think a defining moment in terms of rock growing up and realizing it could be more about, you know, a cute haircut.
He was also in a new role, frontman, even though his friends say performing live made him anxious.
While he told me that he was nervous about being on the stage and being the coordinator of the event and so forth, when he got up on the stage, he seemed like he had been doing it all of his life, like he might have played with the Beatles or something.
But while hitting new peaks creatively, there was a surprise setback when he was sued in 1975 for copyright infringement.
A particular body blow to his creativity was when he was sued over My Sweet Lord bearing too much of a resemblance to He's So Fine by the Chiffons, and he lost a lot of confidence as a songwriter.
He was accused of subconscious plagiarism and even played his guitar in the courtroom to convince the judge otherwise. But years later, he paid a large sum to resolve the case. The real cost was much higher. Critics say that much of his work after that was more hesitant.
I mean, I can sympathise with him in a way because, I mean, there's only sort of 12 notes in the chromatic scale, and surely sort of every combination of them has been used up.
If he retreated at all, it was deeper into his spirituality. He was becoming more and more serious in his study of Indian philosophy and religion. Some argue he was too focused, at least for his wife, Patty.
But I think that he got far too involved in that for her particular liking. And also, I mean, I think that at that time Eric Clapton, who was George's best friend, was kind of sniffing round her.
Rumors flew about Patty and Eric. After Patty and George divorced in 1977, she married Eric Clapton.
I think only George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Patty really understand that relationship. But for the rest of us who weren't part of that relationship, we got some great music out of it. Patty inspired great work out of George, and there's this other record called Layla, you might have heard of, that it also came from that relationship.
Clapton said he wrote it as a love song to Patty. The two men remained close friends in spite of it all. Within a year, George met Olivia Arias of A&M Records, who became his companion. They had a son, Danny, in 1978, and were married shortly after.
She was very